So how do we measure personality? Well, there's two main tools, and we're going to talk about them both. The first is a personality inventory, and that's sort of a big true or false multiple choice test. So you read these statements and you indicate whether you agree with them or how well it describes you. Those are called inventories. And the other technique is called a projection technique. Remember we talked about the defense mechanisms that Freud had, and sometimes they involve projecting your own feelings onto other people? Well, projective techniques assume that you project your feelings and struggles and wants and desires onto images that you see and interpret. Personality testing is done all the time today. It's very common. It's used in hiring, making HR decisions for whether you'll hire someone or what kind of job you would hire that person for. They're also used to identify different types of mental illness. And let's start with the most popular personality inventory. This is the MMPI, the Minnesota Multiphasic Personality Inventory. Guess where the MMPI was developed? University of Minnesota. That's right. This is used a lot. The long version of the MMPI has 500 questions in it. But it can identify consistently a lot of different things, like whether somebody is cynical or demoralized or depressed or suffers from beliefs of persecution, or whether they're faking a mental illness or they're angry or they're obsessive. Now the MMPI it's really curious. There's no particular theory behind it. It's just that they've worked a very long time to find out how different groups of people tend to answer these questions. So the questions, there's no theory behind them. There's just a statistical relationship between the answers that people give to various questions and the conditions or personality types that those people have. So there's no particular reason why a question like, I like gardening magazines, would be useful in identifying personality, but it turns out they do. Some of the questions used in the MMPI to catch people who are trying to fake a mental illness would be a statement like, I get angry sometimes. Well, everybody gets angry sometimes. So people who say that's false, The second type of personality measure are these projective tests. They're grounded in Freudian theory. Again, the idea is whatever conflicts you're dealing with in your life are actually going to be projected onto how you interpret stimuli. There's no right or wrong answers to the questions that people are asked. Well, have you ever seen drawings like these, Inkblot drawings? These come from a test developed by a guy named Rorschach. Surprisingly, the test is called the Rorschach test, or the Inkblot test, and it's about 100 years old. The Inkblots, as you'll notice, are always symmetric. The original test used about 10 different inkblots, and you can see that the inkblots are super ambiguous. And the idea was, still is, they're still used today, that whatever you're struggling with in your own life will influence the ways in which you interpret each of these inkblots. So let's look at the one on the top there. A lot of people look at that and say they see a butterfly or a bat. Biology students who have been studying human neurophysiology might say, part of a spine. But what you don't often hear is, I see mom having sex with a postman, right? That would be one of the responses that would get a therapist's attention. Or, let's see, the second one, it looks like two people playing patty cake, or maybe a four-legged animal. Those are sort of common replies, but you probably don't see, blood dripping off your child's face, right? So again, there's no right or wrong answer because you're just giving an interpretation to a stimulus that's entirely ambiguous. How are the answers to Rorschach tests actually measured? Well, see, that's the problem. They tend to be pretty subjective. It's one of those things that's kind of more art than science. So the person giving a Rorschach will look for things like, are there certain themes that run through your interpretations of the stimuli? Is there a lot of violent imagery, for example, or do people report issues of infidelity or mistrust? How do a person's responses map onto the most common responses? Can the therapist see how you might have come up with that interpretation of the stimuli? So Rorschach tests are measured in a way that's pretty subjective, pretty personal. The other major projective technique is called the TAT, or the Thematic Apprehension Test. And in this test, what people see are not completely ambiguous drawings, but sort of ambiguous drawings. So you can see here, say the middle picture, there's a man leaning forward, and there's a woman who's holding him in some way. And you just look at that picture and you're asked to say, tell me a story. What do you think is going on in these? What is this guy thinking? What is the woman thinking? Tell me a story. On the far right, there's a young woman and an older woman, and you could say, well, maybe the older woman is thinking about her life when she was young, and the young woman's thinking about how she wants to get a new job, whatever. So again, the assumption here with the TAT is that people project their own struggles and issues, what they're paying attention to in their own life, onto these drawings. So for example, maybe if you were in a marriage that was breaking up, you might look at the center picture and say, the husband's leaving and the wife's begging him to stay. The scoring here is again pretty subjective. It's based on the intensity of the emotions that were projected onto the picture, how frequently certain emotions or reactions are projected onto the picture, how long they last. And TATs are pretty widely used. Now, both of the projective techniques that we've just talked about, the Rorschach test and the TAT, have problems with both reliability and validity. So by reliability, it turns out if you give the same, say the TAT, maybe I give you the TAT and a different psychologist gives you the TAT, we might draw completely different conclusions. So it's not super reliable. There's also a problem with validity. Sometimes perfectly healthy people are interpreted as having a mental illness, and people with a mental illness are interpreted as being perfectly healthy. So they're common tests, but again, it's not so much a science with projective tests, it's more of an art. Students in my class, you are going to get a chance to take the Rorschach test and to identify your big 5 personality traits in this unit's labs. And that's it for personality. Thank you.